All right. Two things is, if you're around on Saturday, again, the Hills of Arts Chorale is singing at St. Paul's Lutheran Church, which is on the way on Bacon Street as you go out of town going west. It's at 7 o'clock. My wife sings in it, so listen to her sing. All right. Second thing is, on the midterm, on the next midterm, there'll be an extra credit question, and it's going to be multiple choice, and it's going to say, what is the name, what is the middle name? Okay. What is the middle name of Professor Wolfram's daughter? And it's going to be, the answer is Rose. Okay? So that'll be, like I said, that'll be an extra credit question on the second midterm. So remember that. And if you're taking notes for somebody, don't tell them that part. Okay? All right. So in the Constitution of Liberty, we were talking about, and we finished the introduction, and we were talking about what liberty is. And he said that, says that liberty is the freedom to act according to your own plan. And that makes sense because if you're thinking about how markets work, in fact, let me close that. If you're thinking about how markets work, they require voluntary exchange, right? They require that you guys decide what you're going to produce, you decide what you're going to buy. That's how it works, right? It's a freedom to act according to your own plan is a key to markets. And it's not necessarily how many courses of action. Right? That's what Hayek says. It's not the number of courses of action. Very much what Bastiat was saying, right? Bastiat was, when he was writing that letter to Louis Blanc, he was saying that, freedom isn't about, do you have more options than the other person? Because if you go that direction, you're going to end up with talking about redistribution, and that's what Hayek is going to. We'll talk about in just a moment. But when Hayek talks about John R. Commons and John Dewey, he's making the same argument. So it's not the amount of opportunities that you have. You and I are equally free as long as we can act according to your own plan. Now, I may have more choices than you because I'm wealthier than you are. And Bill Gates may have more choices than I do. But it doesn't mean that I'm not free because I have the ability to act according to my own plan within my circumstance. He also makes the point that it's not necessarily political freedom. It's not necessarily political freedom. It's not, freedom is not, or liberty is not the ability to elect your own dictator. And there's a lot of confusion about that. Oftentimes you'll hear people act as if, well, we want to have democracy in these places. That if South Africa gets democracy, then the people are going to be free. Or if Venezuela gets democracy, then the people are going to be free. Or if Iraq gets democracy, then the people are going to be free. That is not what Hayek is saying liberty is. It's not the ability to, like I said, elect your own dictator. Democracy is a mechanism to lead to that. one of the, well, first of all, Mises talked about this as one of the foundations of liberalism is democracy, because it creates social cooperation, right? And you guys don't feel like you have to overthrow the government in order to defend yourself or to make an improvement. Hayek's saying the same thing, and he'll have a whole chapter on democracy that we'll talk about. But the point here is you need to distinguish between democracy and freedom. If you look at the Arab Spring, what happened in the Arab Spring was a bunch of authoritarian governments were overthrown and there was a democracy. Well, that didn't work out so well. The economies were in chaos, and now we have the restoration of authoritarian governments, etc. So nobody's going on spring break, right? Nobody's going to Syria, I don't think, for spring break, just because it's got, the best, it's got good weather and, there's nice resorts there, right? That's not where you're going on spring break. You're not going to Iraq on spring break. You're not going to Yemen on spring break. What's the problem? Well, it's because democracy doesn't necessarily lead to freedom. They might be related in the same way that we talked about it in Mises' liberalism, that if you have democracy, then you're more apt to have social cooperation, but they're not one and the same. And we've talked about how Hong Kong and Singapore are number 1 and 2 in the index of economic freedom, but certainly don't have political freedom. So a free people is a society of free individuals, right? It's a society of you guys being able to act according to your own plan. Then he says, he relates what he thinks the purpose of government is. He says the purpose of government is to minimize coercion. And we already talked about what is coercion. Coercion is acting according to someone else's plan. So, someone else's plan. That's the purpose of government, to minimize the total amount of coercion. And in the absence of government, we're going to have coercion. That's what Mises says in liberalism, right? That is, he says, classical liberals are not anarchists, that you need somebody to protect the property rights. So, similar idea here is, in the absence of government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So what are you going to do? I'm going to form a government in order to protect us from coercion by individuals. Now, of course, the problem is how do you limit your government, right? And that's we're going to develop in some detail. How do we get it so that we don't have the government becoming coercive? And why does he get to this idea of freedom being important? And it's because he argues that freedom is necessary for the best use of decentralized knowledge. Again, it sounds a lot like what Mises was talking about, right? What you just answered on the midterm is why central planners can't create wealth for the masses. And the answer, one of the answers is, or one part of the answer is, because your central planner cannot possibly know what everybody wants. And why is that? Because knowledge is decentralized. Hayek is writing the exact same thing here, right? Knowledge is decentralized. So what's the best way to make use of that? He wrote a paper in 1945 called The Use of Knowledge in Society, which I have put on in the Wolfram folder in your Econ 105. And it's one of the articles that won Hayek the Nobel Prize. He wrote it in 1945. And what does he talk about in this paper? He talks about knowledge being decentralized. And of course, we know what happens in a market. In a market system, price serves as a signal, right? We know that 9 million people woke up in New York City today, and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and exactly the right amount of peanuts and exactly the right amount of toilet paper or whatever. Why is that? Because you won't be out of equilibrium for long periods of time. If there's excess demand, we know that prices are going to change. If there's excess supply, prices are going to change. And when they do, people who are the consumers respond, and people who are the producers respond until we get to equilibrium. So how do we know what the best use of this decentralized knowledge is to say, okay, I want you guys to act according to your own plan, and so within this system, then. We want people, he says, we want people to use their knowledge and act as a thinking being, right? We want people to make the best use of their knowledge and act as a thinking individual. To make the best use of this decentralized knowledge, what's going to happen? You guys have to go out and think about things. You guys have to decide, hey, this is the best vehicle for me. I've thought about it. I've looked at CarMax or whatever. I've made some decision based on what I looked at as the marginal benefit and the marginal cost, and I think the marginal benefit's bigger than the marginal cost, so I'm going to go ahead and buy this car. Or you decide where, what kind of job you want to undertake, what kind of job you want to try to get at. And so if we don't have freedom, if we're not free to act according to your own plan, you don't have to think about that. And when we read How the West Grew Rich and we talk about feudalism, you guys didn't have to think about what was the best way to fertilize or what was the best crop to grow here, right? You didn't have to think about that because you couldn't act according to your own plan anyway. So what what Hayek's point here is that this system of individual initiative, right? You're going to initiative, right? What does that lead to? That leads to innovation, right? That leads into innovation. So if you're not free to act according to your own plan, why would you innovate, right? Innovation is not going to occur in that. You're not going to make, what I'm trying to do is you guys know what's best for you, whether you ought to be majoring in economics or majoring in biology or English or whatever you're doing, okay? You guys, what we want you to think through, what's the best major for me, rather than when you got to Hillsdale College, it's just assigned you a major and said, okay, here's, you're going to be a biology major and you're going to be an English major or whatever, and just assign you, and then you have to go that way, right? We want you to be able to think through this. Then he argues that liberty is not power, which is what Bastiat had said, right? That liberty is not power. It's not the power to accomplish something, okay? Because if again, he's discussing in this section this confusion of John R. Commons and John Dewey, who are contemporaries, and they were both arguing that liberty is power. Well, this is very similar to what Bastiat, when in the law, where he's writing to Louis Blanc and he's saying, liberty's not power. Mr. Blanc, you've got this goofed up. That if you talk about liberty as being power, then if the wealthy have more power than the less wealthy, this thing always leads to an argument for redistribution. Usually what happens is people say power is related to income. And so if power is related to income and liberty is power, if liberty is the freedom, if liberty is the power to accomplish things, if that's related to your income, and then I want to make people equally free, I'm going to have equal incomes. So what this is all about, when you hear somebody that might be running for president or running for Congress or whatever, and they say we need to have a wealth tax, we need to have a 70% tax on people's wealth, right? They're not saying we need to have a 70% tax on people's wealth, which has been a proposal from some folks on one particular political party. So if you have a 70% tax on wealth, they don't say, well, we need that in order to fix the damn roads, right? Like Gretchen Whitmer, your governor, that's what she ran on, right? We're going to fix the damn roads. But nobody's saying that we need to have the 70% tax on wealth in order to generate enough revenue to fix the roads. They're talking about we need to have a 70% tax on wealth because it's not fair, or the wealthy have this power and we need to worry about the power of the 1%. Okay? They're too powerful. So what they're talking about then is equating, as John R. Commons talked about in the 1940s, what Louis Blanc talked about in the 1840s. We're talking about this idea that liberty and power are associated with one another, that power is related to income, and then you're just talking about redistribution, what Mises called politics of envy. And so, again, the only way to justify the 70% tax on wealth is to argue that what John R. Commons and John Dewey and Louis Blanc argued, that this is about equalizing liberty by equalizing power, by equalizing incomes. What Hayek argues is that even if you're poor, you are just as free as the person that's not poor, as long as you can act according to your own plan within your circumstance, right? So you get to act according to your own plan. Right? Given your circumstances. So you might be poor and have fewer options than somebody that's wealthy, but if you can still act according to your own plan, given what your situation is, then you're free, right? Then you have liberty. You might be wealthy and you are told what to do, okay? Then, we mentioned, I think Queen Victoria, when she was real young, was queen, but she didn't get to tell people what to do, right? They told her what to do. Again, my wife likes Queen Victoria, likes that Victoria show. I'm more of a, again, Last Man Standing show. I don't know if you've ever seen that one, but in any event, if you are poor, but there's no one coercing you, then you're free. See, freedom is about coercion, or lack of, if you're free, there's a lack of coercion. You might be wealthy, but be coerced all the time, and then you're not going to be, then you're not going to be free. Then he talks about what happened historically. He says, well, what happened historically in the West is that says historically, we went from particular liberties granted by the authority to general liberty. That is the way it started in the West. I mean, why did we end up where we did? Why did we end up with the West having a free society compared to the rest of the world? Why is it that Egypt didn't turn into a free society, or why didn't the Incas turn into a free society? Because he says that there was basically a philosophical, a political philosophy that was developed in the West that didn't develop other places. And part of that was, how did we start to get to be free? We started to get to be free by being granted individual liberties by the authority. Maybe it's the Lord or the king. So the king says, okay, you guys can do this. Or, okay, the Lord says, okay, serfs, you guys can do that. That's not the way we look at it today. Today, you assume you can do something unless you're told you can't, right? If you're looking for a parking space, you're not driving around looking for a sign that says you can park here and assume that you can't park anywhere else. You just look at it just the opposite. As long as there's no sign that says you can't park, you think, okay, I'm free to park. So generally, that's the point, is that you normally assume you can do something and then there's a law against you doing it. And so what we've moved is, in the West, we moved from a feudal system where individual liberties were granted to you by the king, to the point where the Lord, to the point where you guys assume that you're free to act according to your own plan unless somebody tells you you can't. Unless I have a law that says thou shalt not steal, okay? So that's, and again, Hayek, we're going to keep coming back to this, but Hayek has this sort of argument about social evolution, that we evolved to, and again, we evolved to this idea of, getting to where we are today because we sort of stumbled upon this idea of the use of knowledge, right? This idea of why we want people to be free. We want people to be free because they're going to make the best use of this decentralized knowledge that we talked about, or you answered on the midterm why central planning can't work, right? So again, you might take a look at Hayek's paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society. Then he argues that ancient Greece is where we sort of started with the liberties that lay the foundation for freedom. Says basically, look, our idea of what a free society is, our idea of how we ought to organize ourselves, which we look at in the West in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. John Locke wrote Second Treatise on Civil Government in the 17th century. So what are we talking about? We're saying this is how we ought to organize ourselves if we're going to be free. Well, what Hayek argues is that those fundamental ideas that show up in the West in that 17th, 18th century, and again, we'll talk more about this when we read How the West Grew Rich, but when does this liberty start coming about? He argues that there were these fundamental freedoms that the ancient Greeks had. The first one of these is that you have legal status as a protected person. If you were free, right? If you were free in the ancient Greece, if you were a free person as opposed to a slave, slaves didn't have these characteristics, or have these fundamental rights. But if you were a free person, you had fundamental rights. And the first one of these, legal status as a protected person. What is that the equivalent of? Well, today we would call that equality under the law. They couldn't treat you differently than anybody else that was free. If you were a free person, if they treated you this way, they had to treat all the other free people that way. And of course, what do we have in our Constitution, right? We have in our Constitution that very provision, equal protection under the law. What's that all about? It's about freedom, right? And we'll talk about this more when we're talking about the characteristics that Hayek thinks is a law, what laws ought to have in order to minimize this total amount of coercion. Legal status as a protected person basically says we're going to have equality under the law. Now, slaves, you could treat them differently. But if you were free, couldn't treat you differently than anybody else that was free. A second one is freedom from arbitrary arrest. If you were a free person in ancient Greece, they couldn't just come along and arrest you and drag you off. Notice that we have the same thing in our U.S. Constitution, right? They can't just arbitrarily arrest you. You have to have a warrant. You either have to be in direct pursuit of a person that you think has committed a crime, or you got to have a warrant. You can't just arrest them. And so that provision that we've talked, that is in our U.S. Constitution, what Hayek argues comes from the ancient Greeks. That was something that they regarded as you needed to be free. The third thing is the right to work at the profession you desire. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be successful, because you may say, gee, I want to be a country western singer. And what it does is it says, if you want to, you can go out and try to do that. You can enter any profession that you like. Doesn't mean you're going to be successful at it, but we're not going to preclude you from that. So if we had, let's say we had a law that says, women can't be policemen. Okay, I don't know what you call police something, police persons. I don't know what you call it, but let's just use policeman as the general term, because how many have ever had Latin? Right. So what is the gender of a noun if you don't say anything? Yeah. It's male, right? Right. So that's the way it works, right? So that's what we're going to do. It includes everybody. We're just going to use the nominative for this. But anyway, women can't be policemen. Okay, suppose we had a law that said women can't be policemen. That would be in violation of this, right? Or if we said we had a law that said that you have to be a policeman, or women can't be plumbers, or men have to be truck drivers, okay? Now, it turns out that most truck drivers are men, but we don't have a law that says that you have to be male to be a truck driver. If you're a female, in fact, if you're a female, you have a better chance of becoming a truck driver in today's world. But nonetheless, that freedom to enter a profession is what was existing in the ancient world, and so that was again, if you were to sort of think about it, if freedom is the ability to act according to your own plan, and your plan is to try to be a truck driver, then we shouldn't preclude you from being able to do that. And so that was one of the characteristics that Hayek points out as important in ancient Greece. The fourth one is the right to movement. And what that means is you can move from one part of the country to another. You could move from, if you were a free person, you could move from one city to another, okay? Or you could move within the city from one spot to another. There was nothing that said, oh, you can't go here. Notice that we have that in the United States as well. Illinois can't require a visa for a citizen of the United States to enter Illinois, right? Or California can't have a visa that says you can't leave California unless you have permission from the state of California to do that, right? You have freedom of movement. You could go from one part of Hillsdale to the other part of Hillsdale. There's nobody blocking you from doing it. So a free person is in ancient Greece had that same characteristic. And so Hayek is saying that's a fundamental liberty that we have today that comes from the ancient Greeks. And then the last one is the right to own property. Notice that this is also what Mises talks about. He says that property is the key to civilization, right? That is, property, and what we're going to talk more about this later in another chapter, but property serves as a boundary in which you get to act according to your own plan. The government can't just enter your house, right? They have to have a warrant to come into your house and look for stuff. They can't just walk in. They can't search your car unless they have some knowledge that you're doing something illegally with your car. They can't just arbitrarily just stop your car and start looking through it. So the right to own property is a key. And notice that there are places where women don't have the right to own property. And the other parts of the world, women don't have the right to own property, but we do in the United States, we do in the West, right? Because that's where freedom really developed. If the when we go to look at what defines our sphere of free action, Hayek is going to talk about that property rights are a key to expanding that sphere of free action. Again, there are places where certain folks don't have the right to own property, and then those places are going to have less freedom than we do. All right, so he says that coercion is having to act according to someone else's plan. Which is why someone else's plan, which is why he wants to minimize that, right? He wants to minimize coercion. Again, why do you want to do that? Because he wants you to be what he calls a thinking and valuing person. Right? He wants to be able to use your knowledge, use your circumstance to be a thinking and valuing person. Why is that? Because that's going to lead to the greatest amount of stuff for everybody, right? What's the best use of decentralized knowledge is you guys running around acting according to your own plan. Sort of Mises arguing why central planning can't work is that the knowledge is decentralized. What Hayek's talking about is what are you trying to do? You're trying to make the best use of this decentralized knowledge. Then what happens is, how can that happen? You guys act according to your own plan, because now you'll be thinking about whether you could innovate here. There's in fact, I was just reading about, I guess it was on the news, about they're working on a way to diagnose pancreatic cancer earlier. And so they were interviewing this woman that's a scientist, and she was talking about that's what they're trying to innovate and try and develop this sort of thing. If she were told you can't do that, right, then she wouldn't even be thinking about it. You want people to be able to use their base of knowledge and to think about, oh, what can I do to make things better? How can I, as he calls, a thinking and valuing person. And so what he says is that we give a monopoly on government we give a monopoly on coercion to government. And then the question is how to limit that. If the purpose of government is to minimize the total amount of coercion out there, I'm going to say, I'm going to give government the power to keep you from stealing my car. I'm going to give government the power to keep you from trespassing on my property. I'm going to give the government the power to keep you from stealing my stuff or whatever. If I'm going to do that, how do I bind the government's coercive power? How do I keep it so that government can't go ahead and do this? If we don't allow for vigilantism, right, in the United States, why not? Because we've given government the monopoly over coercive power. Now, then as we said before, Bastiat talks about government ought to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property, and Mises talks about the same thing, but they don't talk about how one might do that. Once we've given a monopoly of coercive power to the government, how do we keep government from becoming coercive itself? So he talks about that. He says, well, the first thing is that we ought to be bound by general rules. And that these general rules should be known. Now, what does he mean by general? Well, Jim Buchanan has wrote a paper, published an article on what Hayek means by general. But he makes it fairly clear what he means by general is you can't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. Right? I can't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. So general doesn't mean I'm going to pass a law that says let there be clean air and we'll just worry about how exactly we're going to do that. It's not about I want the law to not be specific. Okay, it's about what he means by general is these are general rules that say I don't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. So, for example, if you were to play Monopoly, some people play Monopoly where the money from community chest or whatever chance, it goes into the middle, and when you land on free parking, you get the money. Okay, has anybody ever played under those rules? Okay, well, all right. That's not the way the rules say. Like if you read the rules themselves, that isn't what happens. Free parking is just free parking. But given that we play that way, what do you have to do? When you start the game, you have to decide, are you going to do it that way or not? You can't wait until you figure out that you're going to be the one landing on free parking, that you say, okay, now we can decide whether the money goes in or not. You make the decision before the game's played, so before we know to whom the law is going to apply. So what Hayek is saying here is very similar. That is, you got to decide what the rules of the game are before before we know to whom is this law is going to apply. So if we were to look at the Ten Commandments, you sort of think of, those aren't general, they're commandments, but they are general in this sense. That is, thou shalt not steal. I don't know beforehand, before I make that law, I don't know who's going to be stealing and who's not. Thou shalt not commit adultery. I don't know beforehand who's going to be committing adultery when I put that thing down there. Thou shalt not bear false witness, okay, or whatever. So I don't know beforehand who's going to be lying and who's not before I do the thing. So the Ten Commandments are general in that sense. And why would we want to do that? We'd want to do that because it's going to limit the ability of government to be coercive. Because if, let's say, I want to be coercive towards a certain group, let's say the Hutus, okay? If I pass a law, and that doesn't have to be bound by being general, I could pass a law that only applies to the Hutus, and it's going to do bad things to the Hutus, okay? Under Hayek, you can't do that. Under Hayek, the law has to apply to everybody. Or at least I don't know to whom the law is going to apply when I start it. So if I don't know, let's say I'm going to do something bad to the Hutus, and I put that law out there, if it has to be general, it could apply to my grandmother, it could apply to my sister, it could apply to my friend or whatever. So I'm less likely to be coercive if I don't know when I put the law out there who's going to be bound by it. If I know who's going to be bound by it, then I could do bad things to them, right? If I said, let's say I said something about, let's say this were 1930s Germany, and I said, okay, we know this law is only going to apply to Jews. Okay, well, that's not general. You couldn't have laws that only apply to Jews if you were following what Hayek said. Okay, because if I am not Jewish or my friends aren't Jewish or whatever, and I want to do bad things to Jews, I can do that. But if I have to do the same thing for everybody, I can't be as coercive. I'm not likely to do something that's a coercive law if it has to apply to everybody when we start. I don't know who it's going to apply to before we get started on it. Okay, so this is different than applying equally to everybody. This is saying before we pass the law, we got to know, we can't know to whom it applies. Notice that if you had a affirmative action, suppose that we said that women have to be a certain percentage of the executives of any firm that's listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Okay. We say, well, women, it's been what's that called? The glass ceiling, and women haven't been promoted, they've been discriminated against, and so we're going to pass a law that requires that you hire so many women within the executive branch of your firm. Well, you could do that, but 15 years later, you could say, you know what? We're not going to allow women, you can't hire women at all, right? We don't want women executives. You got to fire all the women executives that you had, and you can't have any women executives, okay? Well, once you've set that principle, you can do that, right? I know this law is only going to apply to women, so I can make it do good things for women right now, but 30 years from now, we might decide to do bad things to women. So any sort of affirmative action law will not fit that principle that Hayek is talking about here. Why? Because you once you've set that principle, you can be coercive. I mean, the same thing that we've talked about more than once. Once you've set that principle, then what happens? There's no limit on what the government can do. Okay. And so that leads us to the next chapter, chapter 2. And what he says he basically summarizes chapter 2. He says, the main contention of this chapter is that the case for individual freedom rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable ignorance of all of us concerning many of the factors on which the achievement of our ends and welfare depend. Okay, so why do we want liberty, right? Why do we want individual freedom? So he says, it's the ignorance of how to best position others, right? Or ourselves. So when he's talking about, again, he says, the main contention of this chapter is that the case for individual freedom rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable ignorance of all of us concerning many of the factors on which the achievement of our ends and welfare depend. So I can't know what's the best way to improve your lot, to make you happier. I can't know that. I can't know what's the best way for you to earn a living. I can't know what's the best way for you to have watch television. Which television stations you're going to like the best. Okay, I can't do any of that stuff. But I may not be able to know myself. That is, I got to have the opportunity to experiment. I may not know that, I am not going to be a very good country western star, but I got to try it, right? If that's, I got to be able to have the ability to go out and try it. People can't tell me, no, you can't be a country western star, because maybe you'll be a good one, maybe you'll be a bad one. But and again, notice that when we talked about the freedom to enter occupations, it doesn't mean you're going to be successful there, but you got to have the right to be able to do it. So what his main point here is that ignorance, right? We can't know what's best for anybody else, and because we can't, then we can't preclude people from doing what they want to do, and we can't force them to do what we want them to do when they don't want to do it. That ends chapter 2. Again, you'll find that some of the chapters, like I mentioned on the syllabus or whatever, some of the chapters we're just going to go briefly through, summarize what they are. You should be able to answer multiple choice or true-false questions from it. We're probably not going to ask an essay question from it. So we're just, like I said, he just summarized chapter 2 for us in that one sentence. Chapter 3 and 4 are going to be very similar. That is, we're going to summarize chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 5, we're going to go through in detail. So over the break, you should definitely finish chapters 3 and 4, and you might want to start chapter 5, because we'll probably do 3 and 4 in not a whole lecture on Monday, and we'll be starting on chapter 5. All right, so anyway,